This is the fifth of our series of conversations with educators, and I just dropped in the chat, let us know your name and where you're coming from, what you do. But Actual Innovations is a group of educators that are interested in our work in innovation. And we do two things. We write in a medium publication called Actual Innovations. And then we have these conversations with people from the group and sometimes people outside the group. And so today, sorry, that was the dog. And so today, I'm really happy to.
At least it wasn't your stomach, because that would have been worse.
But yeah, what is wrong with this? Okay. Yes, so today I'm really happy that Bill Rankin is joining us and who will be highlighted. First time I heard about Bill was back in 2020 when I read a Medium piece that he wrote called Education is Over, which I thought was amazing. And of course I showed that it was forwarding it to people, and of course it created such extreme reactions. Some people just loved it and some people couldn't just deal with it. But it's a brilliant piece. I totally recommend you read it. And then more recently, I heard Bill speak on redesigning higher education. And this came out of the Maynooth University Innovation Lab. And of course, that was an amazing talk as well. And of course, I was also interested because it came out of through a college in Ireland, which is where I'm from. So I didn't go there, but I know it. I went to UCC. So Bill is also a former university professor and a learning designer. So welcome, Bill, and I'll pass it right over to you.
Hey, thanks very much. And really, those may have been okay things, but this is not going to be good. So just prepare yourselves for that, and I do have to say that this is sort of a work in progress, and I'm hoping actually that you guys will help me progress. I'm relying on you for making it all happen somehow. But I do want to think about assessment a little bit, and I want to ask some sort of some questions about it, and kind of walk through this challenge that I'm facing, and maybe we can kind of come up with something to help me, to get me out of this horrible mess that I'm in. And so I want to think about designing assessment, but assessment that thinks about a lot of things, that thinks especially about making learning and learning by making. And so I want to start with sort of thinking about a kind of history of assessment and where it comes from. And I want to ask some questions about it. And, we might just kind of chat about this if you want to talk about it, but it's also something to hold sort of in the back of your head for now. And I want to think about, first of all, what the purpose of assessment is and who it's for. I want to think about what the purpose of grades are and who they're for. And I want to ask whether those are the same thing. Are assessments grades? Are grades assessment? Are they always the same thing? I want to think about what we assess and what we ignore. And then I want to think about the sort of culture, the learning culture that our current system of assessment builds. So that's the first stopping off point. What do you guys, is there anything that you want to say or think about these questions before we proceed further? Like, who do you, when you are assessing, or when you've been around, people being assessed, what's that about? What's it for? Primarily.
It's something that we in MakerEd has been struggling with for quite a while. I work at a project-based learning school with it's a K-5 school, and we have an on-site makerspace that I manage. And not everybody is going to be into sewing. Not everybody is going to be into soldering and things like that. And when they do try it out, they're gonna stop at various levels. I mean, that's where they're gonna max out because that's where their interest stops. Yet how do we evaluate them on those things? So I just posted a piece I wrote about that. You all can read offline. It's not that long, about the concept, but it really struggles with these questions that you raise. I don't have an answer. I'll have some suggestions and maybe a direction we can take, but these are significant, particularly when we get into the PBL and maker ed spaces.
That's exactly where I'm about to head, because that's one of the challenges I'm trying to think through. Like, it's pretty easy to assess a standardized content area. Do you know it? Do you not know it? Well, that's pretty easy, except it becomes harder if I say, well, can you apply it? Because knowing it and applying it are two different things. I can know things. This is sort of what, before everyone came on, we were talking about some of the challenges that we're seeing in schools where people who ostensibly passed through a science curriculum seem unable to think through issues around the virus and mask wearing and basic science, or even the sort of logical notion that, I mean, for goodness sakes, I'm an old fellow and I was not allowed to go to school as a kindergartner without certain vaccines. I had to have a polio vaccine. I had to have a smallpox vaccine. I had to have measles, mumps, and rubella. I had to have all these things which were required. But now somehow people have shifted that for ideological reasons, but they somehow can't seem to think through the logical fallacies of their positions, and yet they've passed through an educational institution somehow successfully. What does that mean? I think we're also seeing some challenges with whether assessment serves learners or whether it serves some other purpose.
Could I add something?
Please.
I think one of the things is that we end up with, when we talk about grades versus assessment, and this is probably what you're going to say, assessment is something that you use to measure the mastery of a concept or skill. And that's what we do with it. I mean, that's how it should be used. Unfortunately, grades get all mixed up because they give people, credit for being for attendance and all this sort of thing. And grades are a different thing. Now, I think because grades get muddled in the system, that pretty soon they become meaningless. And somebody pointed out that it really isn't for the kids, it's for the adults. And actually it's for the colleges, so that they know whether they can get them into the who they want. But I think what's really important is that we remember that the grades are actually trying to provide feedback as to how well they've mastered this, and we need to use that to move forward, so that when they get into chemistry, that they do have, we know whether they have the background for doing the math that's necessary for that, and having that type of perspective.
Yeah, although there are certainly complications, and it goes back a bit to what Mark was talking about. So a student who starts out with nothing and makes some progress, is that better or worse from a grade standpoint than someone who started with a lot and makes almost no progress? How do we assess the motion of that student? And how do we think about what that motion indicates about future learning and work? And it's not an easy challenge, certainly. And it's something I think I just kind of, well, I'm colliding with it right now. So it's something that I wanted to think through.
That's some of the thinking that I've done. It's not an absolute standard, but where did they start? Where did they end up? How do they apply themselves? And the evaluation methods are squishier. And thereby much more difficult for a teacher, but perhaps more appropriate for the learner.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you've run across Marilyn Strathern's work. She's an anthropologist of some renown, dame of the British Empire. And she has this great essay. The link is at the bottom of the slide here. She has this great essay about assessment and ratings and grades and the whole shebang. And it's a hearkening back. She goes back early, and those of you who know me know that I'm interested in history quite a bit. So she's thinking about the transformation of grades in the 18th century specifically. Prior to the 18th century, all assessment is oral and individualized. So can you do this, and at schools. Of course, there's also all the assessment that happens when people are involved in trades and guilds and in learning applied information. But at Cambridge, at Oxford, at the Sorbonne, there's this shift in the 18th century. And that shift is, first of all, from oral to written standards as a way of trying to rationalize and standardize and objectify grading, to make it so that it's all the same. This is the age of reason, and this is a project that grows out of that particular movement. And the key here is what she recognizes is once grading moves from this kind of oral, relational, personal approach to this standardized, objective approach, it shifts its focus. It becomes much more about not the learner, but about the institution. So this is this little bit from this great, and it's a fun read anyway. The enhanced auditing of performance returns not to the process of examining students, but to other parts of the system altogether. What are to be subject to examination now are the institutions themselves. To put it briefly, not the candidate's performance, but the provision that is made for getting the candidates to that point of examination. Institutions are rendered accountable for the quality of their provision. And I think if there's been one shift in assessment over the course of my academic life, from being a student through being a professor, it is the shift from a focus on the learner and learning to a focus on the institution, which kind of came to its apex with No Child Left Behind and kind of all those things, where the school's funding is dependent on its performance by students on standardized exams, right? So if your school is going to get funding from the government, then a certain percentage of your students have to pass the math and reading and whatever tests. But of course, this leads to a bit of a problem. And she adapts Goodhart's law here. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So if it's important for 80% of students to pass the reading portion, the reading exams, so that the school can get its funding, or so that it can be accredited, or so that whatever, then what I'm going to do is ensure that 80% of the students pass regardless of whether they actually have good reading skills. I will drill them on the exam. I will force them to perform well on the assessment, because the assessment is about institutional provision, not about learning. And of course, there's a side note on that as well. There's another kind of point of blowback, which our friend Audrey Waters talks about. She's got this great new book, which you should read, absolutely, that's out, that's really about a kind of critique of Skinnerian approaches to education. But she's talking about LMSs here on her great blog, which is hackededucation.com. And she talks about LMSs. The learning management system, as the name suggests, is as much a piece of enterprise software as it is educational software. That word management is a dead giveaway that the software is designed neither for students nor for workers. The LMS is an administrative tool designed at the outset to post course materials online in such a way that the institution, not the open web, could control access. It monitors student performance and productivity, to be sure, but it can readily be used to surveil instructors as well. So here's the other fun thing. Not only is assessment increasingly about institutional capacity, it's also about individual teacher capacity. Did you do your job in teaching those students, and are you doing the things that you're supposed to do? Which is complicated, because then teachers are invested in making themselves look pretty good too, right? Like, my job depends on how well I get people through. So now we've got this kind of complicated system of complicity in which we're really not focusing a whole lot on learners, but we are focusing a whole lot on institutional credibility. We're focusing a lot on, okay, did you use this tool? And I know that this LMS thing is true, by the way, because my wife, who is an IT resource teacher and instructional coach, she watches to see, have you logged into Google, to do what you said you were going to do in Google Docs in the last month? No? Okay. So, I mean, we've got all these people watching what we're doing online, and with things like Zoom now, and with stuff that's in place for COVID, we've got this real shift. So this is my struggle, is what I see from assessment is a move increasingly towards institutional interests and increasingly away from learning interests. And the reason that's important to me is this. So I have become increasingly over the course of my career a champion of learning by making, of doing stuff, of applying stuff, not just in the decontextualized space of a classroom, but in practice in the real world. And my favorite recent research about this comes from these two researchers, Curtis and O'Brien at the University of Chicago, which, again, this is just an absolutely hilariously fun paper to read. So they did all these tests in which they showed people brief videos of performing particular tasks. Like, one of them was a magician pulling a tablecloth out from underneath a fully set table. And so they'd show that to people like 50 times, and then they'd ask people if they thought they could they do that? And everyone said, yeah, absolutely. And what Curtis and O'Brien's research shows is that we live in this world where we've got unprecedented access to media, where we can watch people do all kinds of things, but it fosters this kind of illusion of skill acquisition. The more people merely watch others perform without actually practicing themselves, the more they believe they could perform the skill too. However, people's actual abilities do not improve after merely watching others. Despite predictions to the contrary, the experiential gap between seeing and doing may sometimes lead people to assume that they have learned more than they have from merely watching. And that fosters this kind of illusion of skill acquisition. And it's sort of, I mean, you can watch someone paint happy little trees and you can feel like, I totally could do that. I think I could do that. I've watched 100 times, I could do that. And, he's so friendly and happy and nice. And you think, that's lovely. But one of the challenges is when that illusion takes precedence, when I can't quickly or easily do it, it amps up frustration massively, or makes me feel like a failure or fraud in ways that often discourage me from application. One of the fun things that Curtis and O'Brien did was they showed people a video of juggling a single bowling pin. So this is not, complicated juggling, right? You just toss the pin in the air and catch it again, and so it flips, it rotates, and then you catch it again. And so they showed 3 cohorts of people this video about 50 times. It was like a 2-second video. And, here's how you do it, here's how you do it, here's how you do it. One cohort, they gave an explanation, like, here's all the strategy for doing it. Here's how you flick your wrist at this point. They gave them this radical explanation. And they first asked everyone, do you think you could do this? That's what the blue lines are. So the explanation group, they gave them all that information and they said, do you think you could do that? There was a bit of a diminishment, but not a significant diminishment in people's belief that they could do that. The next cohort, they gave them lots of technical information, like, here's the weight of the bowling pin, here's its length, here's how much force it requires. They gave them tons of technical information. Do you feel like you could do it? Yeah, I pretty much think I could. The last cohort was really interesting. They just had people hold the bowling pin for 1 minute. And people said, I don't think I could do that. They recognized that it was going to be harder. It Dunning-Krugered them. Just holding the bowling pin made them recognize, maybe I can't do this all on my own. And that idea of actually engaging people in the learning experience, in the application experience, so that this learning isn't just in their heads, is the thing that I've been working on for my career. We don't learn as much from watching as from experience. So how do we get people more experience? Now, even when we give them the experience, we are typically giving them a recipe or a set of instructions. And our goal is, well, everyone should look the same. Yours doesn't look the same as yours, so you get a D and you get an A, that kind of thing, right? But that's not really what I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about this kind of standardized instructionist assessment where we all make the same thing and we follow the same instructions. That's a starting point, but there's got to be something more than that. A few years ago, I was involved in this program. I helped design, and we were the first school in the world to do a one-to-one on iOS. When iOS was the only thing there was. There wasn't iPads yet. There wasn't anything else. There was just, the iPhone. And one of the things we recognized was that when you were sitting in a classroom, you could focus really on just kind of one dimension, the content dimension. There was no way to get in the community of people. There was no way to move people into a different context where they could be applying this thing. And I don't just mean the physical context, but also, kind of sociocultural, historical, all these other sort of contexts that you run into in the real world. So we could really only talk about what we could do with content. But when we gave people these mobile devices that let them carry the library around, carry video tools around, carry all these creation tools around with them into the world, then we could start thinking about how they actually engaged with community and how they engaged in a variety of contexts and made things. And so this was this kind of work that I did on cubic learning. And it's something I've continued to work on and continue to refine. For example, it was one of the things, I think it's one of the reasons that MOOCs didn't work out. Because while the MOOC gave you 24/7 access to content, it typically was really crappy at giving you access to community. And it was even worse at getting you involved in context, even though everybody was spread out in their own context. You did these standardized activities on the MOOC that didn't really take advantage of your particular space where you were. And so it was really just an extension of the content domain and not the other two. So have you guys bumped into the DIKW pyramid ever? Do people know this? So no one knows the origin of this. There's a T.S. Eliot poem that kind of has much of this in it. It's hard to know where it comes from exactly, but the idea is this, that data put into structures, frameworks, and algorithms becomes information. Information put into uses, practices, and context becomes knowledge, and knowledge enculturated becomes wisdom. And those bottom two things are about content. They're about the content dimension. But you can't turn content into knowledge without involving context, and you can't turn knowledge into wisdom without involving the community. And the problem is that we spend an awful lot of time getting our students ready for these bottom things, which is very much about mechanization, which I've spelled the British way just because. And then the top part is really where we see the human coming into place. And the problem is, if I turn people more and more into producing information and data, what I'm really doing is guaranteeing their obsolescence, because machines will do that more and more. if I'm not involving them in those upper two pieces, I'm not really preparing them for the future. So I not only want people to be making in a context, I want them to be turning their information into knowledge and turning their knowledge into wisdom. I want them to be making in context and in community. So I've been working on this framework, this structure, that's this kind of fourfold framework that grows out of that cubic model, that starts with some direct instruction, a step-by-step procedure. Here's the instructions, follow them, you know, do exactly what I say. But I don't care that finishing that project is not the test. That's just the starting point. So if you need help, if you need to work with other people, if you need to get resources from the web, if you need your parents to help or your friends or whatever, no problem. I just want you to have the experience of making this thing. Because what we're then going to do with it is then I want you to mess with what's already there. And the reason is if I just give you a box of stuff, you don't really know what to do with it. Mostly, like I've never seen that before. I don't know what to do with that. But if I have you build something with it, and then I say, what would happen if you switch that part with this other part, or if you change that positive number to a negative number, or I don't know, if you use this transition instead of that transition between those video clips, you're starting to kind of figure things out. You're making those mental models, those schemata that, you know, are important for learning. So the tinkering becomes the place where instead of trying to standardize students, I want students to start with a standardized project that they then personalize, and that brings increasingly their perspective, their needs, their community, their context into play. Once you've tinkered with it and figured out how things work, now you're ready to make, which is very much about independent practice and performance assessment. And then you've got to bring it back for share, which is this kind of authentic assessment, this practice of fusion skills, and specifically in three areas. How does where you compare your projects with someone else's, where you coordinate and collaborate, maybe you combine your projects or the best features of them to do something bigger, or where you compete. Which one is the most efficient in using resources? Which one is the most fun to play? Which one is the one that's going to be most sustainable in the environment? And so that structure, that strategy is something that I've been working on. So, you know, some examples like, you know, maybe there's a video example where you're going to assemble these video clips. Everyone has the same clips, and you start with, and here are these transitions. I want you to build it this way. Or you start with some code, and I want you to write this, you know, code, and then I want you to run it. Or you know, take this sample and you mix it with the reagent and you swirl it over the heat for 3 seconds, and this is what happens. But then in tinkering, you're going to play with what's already there. In making, now you're going to make something that's your own. And then in sharing, you bring it back again for competition, collaboration, or comparison. So it looks kind of like this, like that first project, everybody's stuff looks the same. In the second one, they start to change them. The third one, people make all kinds of crazy stuff. And then in the fourth piece, you know, we see how those pieces fit together. And the problem is the assessment models that are out there are really hard for doing any of this kind of stuff that I've been working on. And by the way, we can also then bring something from that share phase or the make phase back and make it a new platform project that everyone does. And then we can start there. Okay, let's all build this together and let's iterate from that point. So what does that do? If you get your project chosen, is that a better thing for assessment, or I don't know. And what I'm looking at here is that first phase is about imitation. Should that be assessed? That second is about variation, but that's this kind of personal exploration. Should that be assessed? Then combination, transformation, creation, that certainly seems accessible. Competition, collaboration, and comparison, those are, again, that is itself a kind of assessment. So the question then is, what do I do? And I thought, when I was talking with Lucy about this, I thought probably the best thing to do would be to bring this kind of problem to you guys, because not that, you know, Weinberger in Too Big to Know, which is about kind of knowledge structures, he talks about the smartest person in the room isn't the person, me, certainly, and it's not even us, it's the network of all of us. It's the network, it's even people who aren't in this call that you know or that you could think of or whatever. So it's the idea of this network. And that's sort of what actionable innovations is about. It's about triggering this network of experts and thinkers to help regular teachers think through challenges and problems and come up with solutions that they couldn't come up with on their own or just from their little set of friends, but by linking together network after network after network, and by each of those networks, you know, sort of triggering and magnifying new stuff. So here's what I've come up with as an assessment strategy. Here's what I want to measure as people move through all this stuff. Now, there's a ton of stuff behind this. And if you are part of the AI group, I will post my big document that walks through all this craziness on there, because I'd love your feedback. And I'm thinking again about these three dimensions: content, context, and community. I had to write this paper, this chapter for a book. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this guy, John Ruskin, who I had never read before. He's a sort of boring Victorian writer, I thought, but I was just continuously blown away by what he was thinking and writing about and working on. And he was really fighting against the industrialization of Victorian England. And what he described was that there were these three facets: the head, the hand, and the heart, and that all of those have to be triggered by learning or by the jobs that we do. And in his ideas gave rise to William Morris was a disciple of his, and the arts and crafts movement, and also British socialism came out of his thinking. And so that's something that kind of appeals to me. And I'm also thinking about this guy, Yong Huang, who has adapted Gilbert Ryle's concepts of mind. And so he says that this kind of intellectual facet, I know that. There's this vocational facet, I know how. And then there's this kind of moral facet, I know to, or I know when to. And so part of what I want is I want every learner who comes through this making experience as they're building knowledge and wisdom to operate in each of these three areas. And I think there are kind of 4 levels of that. And by the way, this sort of then connects to those earlier things that I was talking about. So the first level is very much about this kind of internal learning, which is about following someone else's guidance and, you know, kind of learning from them. And then as I start to move that into service to my neighbors, I'm tinkering with that and experimenting and seeing what works. And then as I get that experience and start really making as this kind of powerful tool for the world, for bigger audiences, I'm synthesizing. And then when I become really good at this thing, I invariably share. And you don't have to be a formal teacher or an old person to do this, right? A kid who has just learned really well how to do, I don't know, whatever, woodworking or surfing, or will tell other people, hey, here's how you do this, even if it's just me playing a video game. And so I've been thinking about building an assessment tool that gets me to these things, because invariably what I measured in school was stuff that I didn't really care about. I measured how much content you knew, and that was about it. And I don't want to do that anymore. So, oh gosh, I forgot to change the title for this. Go ahead.
So what do you imagine the tool to look like? Is a framework that teachers can use to implement? Is it an actual, when I think of tools, I think of something digital. I'm curious what you're thinking about as the tool.
I'm also curious about what I'm thinking about as the tool. I actually have a kind of table that I've drawn, like where I'm imagining that the way you do this assessment, I can't believe I forgot to change here, I'm going to bring that slide back up. So that what you do is that this is kind of rubric based. And I was thinking about who does this. You can't put the burden of all this on teachers. So I used to teach this class called Business and Professional Writing, for example, which started out as just the worst class ever. And I taught these, really privileged business students who would tell me when I'd have them, building these informational projects. I was an English teacher, and this was a writing class, and they'd say, I don't need to learn this. My secretary will do this, which made me want to kill them in a variety of ways. But what I started doing was having them go make stuff for local nonprofits. And then I had the nonprofits assess how well did they work with you? How well did they, interact with you? What about the project that they made? Was it helpful? And what was fascinating was these really privileged students who really didn't think that an English teacher had anything to teach them. They were upper division business students. They started getting really into it because it was stuff that they could put on their resumes, and because they realized like, oh, wow, I actually do need to. And we ran into all kinds of crazy problems that I never would have imagined when we were simulating stuff in the classroom. And so by bringing in that other group, it actually took a lot of the assessment burden off of me. I mean, I could think about how they worked as a workshop in class, but a lot of that other stuff was people would respond to me and I would have them, kind of fill out a rubric. And then that was something that I could evaluate. So I don't know, Lucy, I don't know if this is a digital tool. I don't know if this is an analog tool. I don't know if this is a procedural tool. There are a lot of ways to think about assessment and to think about, kind of what we do. And so part of it, and I apologize, I stole this slide to just the format of the slide, and I forgot to change the title. That's so embarrassing. But there were some questions I just wanted to ask people, and I'm going to take some notes. And I wanted to think about, like if you think about assessment tools that you use, what makes it easy? What makes it hard? What are the resistance points for whether this is, okay, well, I'm using this digital tool and, here's this great thing that I really like, or I'm using this procedure or whatever.
Bill, I can tell you what assessment tool I use for my graduate students. So I teach a class at Teachers College Columbia in design thinking. And, they're learning how to use design thinking to solve problems in EDU. One thing I'm requiring them to do is to leave behind a digital footprint that people can see. Okay, and I can be any format. I don't care if it's Instagram. I don't care if it's a WordPress blog, whatever. So that's one thing that I require them. The second thing is that their final product, service, or system, whatever they have designed, is in a pitch format. And I bring in up to 20, 30 people, and they're the ones that assess it. So it's a real live audience.
Yeah.
And I feel that's fairly authentic for them. Some of them go on to develop those products further, which is great, but that's usually maybe one or two. I try to make it as real as possible.
So is there friction from making it so open-ended?
No. I find, because I use the same method with high schoolers where I teach entrepreneurship, it's exactly the same thing. And no friction at all. They like it. And it's as authentic, I feel, as I can do in the constraints of a school.
Do you feel that the authenticity is an important factor, that the fact that they're putting something out in the world rather than, say, in a closed garden LMS, does that make a difference, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it has to be outside a closed LMS. The authenticity to me is crucial. And I'm always looking for the authentic, even if it's like, well, you've designed this app that is trying to connect interns with teachers. Let's bring that to a school and ask them, or let's bring that to the teachers. So yeah, I will always involve experts if I can. And I lean on everyone, as Lucy knows. I mean, everyone I know at some point has assessed for me. or has come into my class and, you know, worked with my students. It's completely unfinancially sound. It's impossible to scale. I don't know who, you know, I don't know who would fund such a thing, but like I said, I lean on my network to help me teach, learn, and share. But they're some of my assessment tools.
Yeah. I'm just going to, by the way, I'm going to bring up all these questions so that, and we can just have a free-for-all discussion, which is fine. So Amy, you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, I being an architect, nearly the entire architectural education is made up of exactly what Don just said. And so whether it mostly design studio is about the culture of outsiders coming to critique and review your work. Art schools are similar. But
and theater programs, performing arts programs. I mean,
there you go.
A lot of the fine arts, and yeah.
So I think that, you know, in terms of the scalability, every architecture school, college that I know does that, and I frequently volunteer to be on those juries. I don't get paid for it, and it's not sort of about the financial piece of it. It's you know, it's about being connected with other professionals. It's about hiring students. You want to see the work, so you get, you know, put offers out to the best students. There's a lot of sort of intangible benefits that aren't, you know, so compensation related. And you know, and I think it's pretty much an international. This is what everything does. You know, this is what design schools do. So in terms of the scalability, I think it's about expectation. It's about putting it out there and having, this is the way we're going to assess learning and achievement and whatever you want to call it for this particular idea. And once that is the standard or the you know, the norm, you know, then you can start tweaking it and fine tuning it. But there's an expectation that works.
Do you think this is just a kind of hothouse, you know, environment for higher ed though? I mean, what about, you know, sort of, I'm a K-12 teacher, and who the heck am I going to bring in to assess my students? I feel like,
well, you know, I taught in the STEM program here in Chicago Public, and our semester end project was to build a building out of that you have designed through the semester out of graham crackers and edible glue, which was a lot of sugar. And then we had the other teachers come in and critique them. And then we got the lunchroom to send up a cart of milk, and we ate them. So, you know, I think it's sort of a matter of, you know, addressing the age group that you're with. And, you know, obviously, you know, not every school can do all that. There would be roadblocks, but this was a, you know, public school in Chicago, and it wasn't like, you know, it has all the budgets and has, but the culture was teachers help each other. The culture was people care about the kids. The culture was you could, you know, bring in parents as professionals to come and do activities and critique and, you know, do those things. And I think the culture, you know, you mentioned community as being that, you know, that really critical element for knowledge. You know, I think that community knowledge really has so many facets of positive impact. It's really hard to think about not engaging the community.
Yeah. Mark, you've got a hand up. What are you thinking?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just struggling with lowering my hand. You know, assessment is bifurcated. I mean, it's both, you know, assessing the students so that we can better design ways to teach them. And it's also assessing the students so that the broader society can evaluate how effective we are at doing that. In other words, keeping score for the teacher. You know, to become, when it comes to, you know, as I was talking about MakerEd and the difficulties of evaluating that for both end results. we can't really control what society expects of education. That's not just the 30,000 foot view, that's the 100,000 foot view. They're going to want to keep score. They're going to want to say, yeah, this teacher's good, this teacher's not so good. So it's like whatever system that we create for our purposes, meaning, our super secret plan of actually teaching students, we have to come up with some sort of, an API or an SDK for linking that out and turning it into what society expects. So we can evaluate the student for teaching purposes, but then it has to sort of translate over into something that says, oh yeah, this teacher can keep their job. I don't know the answer. Again, I guess I'm a lot better at asking questions than providing answers.
Yeah. Well, you bring up, it's an interesting point, because on the one hand, we use assessment as a developmental tool, as a formative tool. So I know where you are as a learner. I think genuine assessment, I'm talking here about not just, I've given you a grade because I got to or whatever, but part of the function of assessment has to be formative so that we know where things are supposed to go. I think part of it is also this kind of badge, like, okay, this person has this status, this person knows this thing. So it's both things. It's this kind of summation of your work. It is formative and summative. And I think part of the challenge is that in many cases, learners don't actually get access to, like, what does that grade mean? Or what does that comment even necessarily mean, like, for me as a learner? And it is difficult to think about developing a strategy that is going to be just as helpful from a formative standpoint as it is from a summative standpoint. So, I've got a 3 in this, but I could have a 5. So I guess that's an area to work on. But it's also a way of saying, this is where I am. And I think, that's a challenge for us. And I think there's this other problem where when we give people those marks, whatever those marks are, those marks become, I always think about this talking about marks, I think about this in kind of Marxist terms. It alienates the student from the student's labor. It becomes a sort of currency. Oh, well, I just want that 5.
And then I stop.
So it creates a ceiling that I'm not going to go through. And we see this happen a lot where, okay, I got the A, so I don't need to keep learning or working or growing or whatever. And that was part of that question I was asking earlier, for the kid who comes in already with certain capabilities, shouldn't they be doing way more? Shouldn't they be extending beyond? And is there a way to do that? And one of the ways that I've figured out is if I send them into the world, they're going to tackle bigger challenges. And so
there's a lot of the postings in the chat that have recognized we really need to.
Yeah, I've just now figured out how to pull that up with my.
We need to honor our broader communities who might have what we consider to be unreasonable expectations or inappropriate expectations. So we not only need to target, our systems, our evaluative systems. We need to sell it. We need to convince our broader communities that they're the right way to go. It's because they're producing students. The families are sending us students who are coming in and saying, "What do I need to do to get an A?" That's the wrong question.
That's right. Well, and because that's important. One of the catastrophic things that happened in the UK last year with the pandemic was, so they canceled GCSEs and A levels, which were the exams that let students pass into university. And they decided what they would do is they would have an algorithm that would figure out what you would likely have gotten. But the algorithm, of course, what it did was it looked at your school and your socioeconomic background. And it basically said, well, people from your group get this. So it just recapitulated existing hierarchical social structures. So rich kids got admitted and poor kids didn't. And suddenly people were unhappy about that. And it led to utter chaos. And the head of Ofsted, which was the group that did that testing and that came up with that algorithm, losing his job. But, you know, it brings up an interesting point. And you know, because if I'm a parent, I want my kid to do well because my kid's future depends on that mark, that, not that formative mark, that summative mark.
This is not entirely related, but I'm thinking, Bill, a little bit about my sister-in-law who was an academic like you and moved into higher ed policy, or actually K-12 policy for the state of Kentucky. And about 10 years ago, they started requiring that every kid in Kentucky took the ACT. And I thought that was really interesting. And she said it was, you know, part of the reasoning was that some of the kids there would not necessarily ever think about taking the ACT. It was not the norm to take it. And for them to at least take it was introducing the concept to them that they could go to college. And so it was, you know, I think it was perceived, I think she thought it was lofty, you know, but I think it's been perceived as like, another test for kids, another way of measuring them in a way that really doesn't reflect what they know and that sort of thing. So I think so there's an equity issue with this. I don't know what I'm getting at here, but there's an equity issue here. And I think from my sister-in-law's perspective, giving the ACT to everyone gave everybody an equal chance of at least, you know, taking a step towards college. How can we can't...
Actually, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'll go ahead and finish and then I'll interrupt with my horrible news.
I'm just wondering, like, you know, how we can't agree on anything in this country educationally, you know, right now. And so, you know, I think certain schools are really open to this sort of thinking. Yeah. And one of the comments I made in the chat was that independent schools have typically had a holistic view of kids and have given lots of feedback to kids in different ways, lots of experiential learning. Typically they write long narratives for grade that go along with grade reports and that sort of thing. And they're constantly kind of shifting how they evaluate things, at least in my experience. And so, you know, there's also a dichotomy here between public and private schools and how we look at kids. It's like, do we see kids as half full or half empty? And anyway, so much interesting food for thought here.
Yeah, there's some really interesting, I wanted to bring up, there's some really interesting research about things like actually the GCSEs and A-levels in the UK or the SATs and ACTs in the US. And it is incontrovertible in study after study that the greatest predictor of your success on those exams is your membership in the dominant socioeconomic culture. So if you're a white kid in the US, you will do better because there's bias in the way the exams are constructed. And it's stuff we've known about for 30 years. And what happened in the UK and what's happened a lot in the US is when students take those standardized tests, ACT, SAT, it looks like it's just a fair, you know, objective assessment. Like, okay, well, everyone takes the same test, so everyone's the same, and everyone's got the same chance. But the deck is significantly stacked for some students. And so when students not a member of that group don't do well because they're not going to, because the deck is stacked, then they increasingly believe not, oh, college is something that might be something I could do. They believe college is not for me because I didn't do well on that test, and you have to do well on that test to go to college. So I guess I'm just out.
There's so many barriers. There's so many barriers like this. And the other one that I'm thinking of too is I saw a friend's discussion about career and tech programs in Chicago, and apparently a lot of kids don't apply for that or apprenticeships and that sort of thing because one of the requirements is that you have a driver's license. And a lot of kids in inner city Chicago do not have that. And I just floored me. So being thoughtful about this sort of thing and like what the barriers are that we may not immediately see, I think is really important. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I think we do have to think about, equity. We have to think about access, and we have to think about the ways that, there is a really important thing in learning critical race theory for every person who's a teacher, at least, because structures that you don't even think about let some people in and some people out. And there are accessibility issues. There's this silly stuff like the significant number of people who have issues with dyslexia, for whom your choice of an alphabet, of a font, can determine whether or not they can successfully read the thing that you made. Or people who have color blindness, your use of, there is this lovely little tool, by the way, for iPhone and iPad called Sim Daltonism that lets your camera get color blindness so you can look at anything you make and see whether or not someone could see it. But there are a lot of important issues around assessment and around, kind of how we build things that's important. And I think for me, the thing that I keep bumping up against is people want something that they can look at a glance and get a summative view. Where are you? What is that badge? But they also, I think I want something that is also formative. I've got to figure out how to balance both of those. And what I've heard from teachers kind of over and over again is that the assessment tools we have in place are the greatest impediment to any academic transformation or change. Well, I would love to have my students learn by making, or do challenge-based learning, or project-based learning, or whatever. But we've got those tests, and they got to do on those tests because I'm going to be evaluated, my school's going to be evaluated, they're going to be evaluated. If we fritter away all our time doing that goofy stuff, then we're not going to be able to pass those tests. And that's a shame. I think that's a real shame.
On that topic, Bill, I was lucky enough to have my kid go to public Montessori K-8, and since it was public, you still had the testing requirements. You still had all of that, but they didn't even tell the kids the day before that there was a test. They would just do their stuff and do their, oh yeah, tomorrow, the test is today. Kids would just interrupt their day, do the test. And it was a top performing elementary school in the city of Chicago. No teaching to the test at all. Not even, so, I think that it goes back to I think what Lucy said earlier about the expectations and community expectations that, we think that that's required. But if you just start teaching the right stuff in the right way and the kids are learning it, there's no need to teach to the test. But that's a perception that makes us still do that.
And I think we teachers, we have a kind of lack of faith. Like, I really have to teach to the test because, whereas if people are actually, if they get those skills and are applying them, and the more opportunities they have for applying them in different contexts, the more likely they are to do well in the test, which is just another context. If I get used to, thinking on my feet, I'm going to think on my feet there too. I know we're about out of time. Oh, go ahead.
Can I add one quick thing? I think also as parents too, we tend to be kind of nervous. Like, we can't let go and just let our kids be and figure things out for themselves, because we feel like we need to kind of control, like if we make these right choices for our kids, that they're going to be more successful in life. And I think that kind of boils down to the teachers also being nervous about the consequences of going outside the box. And I've really tried with my kids who are now out of high school to kind of the last 4 or 5 years to kind of kick back and not micromanage them some more. And it's interesting to see how that evolution has happened. But this week at our high school, there's a mental health day, a training day for sophomores through seniors. And there's some discrepancy whether it's required or not. And apparently a lot of kids are like really worried that if it's not required and their teachers are still teaching and they miss class, that they're going to be out of luck and they don't want to miss class no matter what. And it was, and the parents were all freaked out about it. It really wasn't coming from, I wasn't hearing this from kids, I was hearing it from the adults in a parent group. And it was so interesting to me that one day of learning differently, something that was really critical to help kids recognize signs of mental distress in their peers, was being, looked at as not worthy, and the kids were so wrapped up in being perfect and not missing class that this was an issue. It was, so I think there's in terms of society, we have to do better in terms of showing what parents what success looks like in general.
Yeah. It's such a complicated issue because there are so many things hanging on this. Future employment, future schools is hanging on this. The sustainability of an institution is hanging on this. The sort of ability of a teacher to continue having a job is hanging on this. And so it's really pretty easy for all those things to kind of push the learning itself out of the way. And I know we're over time. I think one of the interesting things too is there are increasingly tools where learners are taking charge of their assessment, so that the teacher says, basically, show me that you know this. And the students figure out a way to do that, which requires portfolios or some opportunity for me to put media online or whatever. But and there are some great things, like there's a tool out of Canada called Fresh Grade that's really interesting, which was designed by a couple of parents who they'd ask their kids, like, what do you do today? And the kids would say, oh, nothing. And then, they wanted a way to kind of interact. Shobi, I know, does some stuff where, parents and the community can be more involved. There are a few things. I don't have a lot of I mean, there are a lot of things that I could put up and at some point will, but I wanted to just, think about, if you're interested in rubrics and making rubrics, the AACU, these are both university resources, but they're handy for anyone. So the American Association of Colleges and Universities has some really nice stuff, and UC Berkeley has some great stuff. If you want to think about kind of ungrading, Alfie Cohn is the fellow who I always think about for this. And this guy, or this person, Jesse Stommel, has some really nice things. That this particular article is just this kind of great resource for lots of thinking about doing things other than just, assigning grades. I'd absolutely spend some time, and if you have not read it or just skimmed it because you had to, I would reread Paulo Freire and think about, the pedagogy of the oppressed and how that, that sort of financial model kind of plays into how we think about assessment. And it's kind of goofy, but I would read John Dewey again. And I don't know, but that's about it. Our time is up. Thank you so much. And, if you have ideas for me, ping me, because I really am trying to figure out a methodology or a strategy or a tool that I can use to figure out this cubic learning idea and this strategy that I've done. I want something that is useful for assessment, but that people will actually use. So anyway, thanks very much.
Hey, Bill, thank you. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you for being with us and creating such a great conversation. And just so you know, you get an A.
Good one, Don.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's all I wanted.
Full disclosure, I was back and forth with Lucy. She was trying to push an A-, but I was like, Lucy. No, it's brilliant. Thanks. Awesome.
I'm game for sticking around and chatting a little bit longer.
Yeah.
There were a couple of questions here. As a non-educator, where do you find examples of alternative assessments and project-based learning? Where can we learn more on the topic? And I suggested PBL Works as a great place for examples. I love Edutopia. And then the other thing that I thought was kind of interesting is we used the Canvas learning management system at my previous school, and there was some great tools for building rubrics on the fly or reusing with with the Google Assignments integration in there. But Bill, any other ideas?
Yeah, I think, and I would, that second, I'll put it in the chat, that second resource that I talked about under ungrading, it has some really nice examples and some things to go look at. So let me stick that in the chat. I'll just put all these in the chat, I suppose, at some point. That would be a useful thing for me to do, wouldn't it? It's so hard to see the chat while you're presenting in Zoom.
I know it is. That's why you have to have, it's easier if you have two devices going, in general.
I was gonna set up another monitor, and then I realized it had a DVI connection, and I have DVI adapters to not the right thing anymore. So I was like, that monitor needs to go away. It's useless.
Yeah, it's impossible to monitor the back channel if you don't have two screens. I just don't know how you do it, because I have two going as well. It's just.
Well,
I have like five
an example of assessment. I've been taking classes at MIT, just online stuff and working towards another degree, but whatever. But one of the classes I took was through Sloan, and it was leadership in organizational change. And so it's a lot of psychology, it's a lot of systems, and but a kind of a complicated topic. And I have to say that I've been very impressed with those classes. I mean, they do them very well. One of the assessment tools at the end was to participate in a simulation. So, I call that a video game, but, it was a simulation, and it was a very well done simulation where, you actually had video interviews with, live people. I mean, it was very kind of integrated. And this was at the end, and if you sort of didn't do the things in the right way and the right sequence and the right tenor, you didn't, you had to bring a company from here to there, and if your company didn't get over there, you didn't pass. I mean, they let you take it a few times, thankfully, because I didn't pass it the first time. I consider myself a pretty good student. But anyway, the simulation thing, I think, is a very underused element. And of course, it has to be masterfully created as a game to remove the biases and, to kind of make it valuable. But even things like, the video games I watch my kid play that are VR, surgery simulator. I mean, it's just this side of Operation, that game where the red nose is light up and stuff. But, so it was a little bit tongue in cheek, but you're a surgeon, you have a table, there's a patient, there's a screen that has all the patient's vitals on it. You have to maintain their oxygen level, their heart rate, their breathe, you have to kind of control a bunch of things. And if they die, you don't win. And so by doing sort of simple things at first, like sutures or alignments, whatever, and you kind of build up to the very highest level is actually brain surgery. But you can't go straight there. You're not going to get all the toggles and tools unless you go through the little steps. And anyway, I think that both my parents were doctors, so I grew up in that kind of world, but I learned so much by playing that stupid game.
Yeah. Well, it's part of what I'm trying to get at with the follow, tinker, make, share framework is the follow one is about building some basic skills, like how do you have to hold a scalpel and how do you have to, but once you've mastered those, then you start to be able to kind of play with it a little bit. And we do this all the time with cooking, for example, like, you follow the recipe, and then you think, I'm going to tweak that a little bit. Like, I think I'm going to add, less oil and more chocolate or, whatever. Right. And you just see like, oh, wow, that didn't work out. But you start to develop an instinct for it. And once those instincts happen, then you are ready to really master those bigger skills. And so I think, we need to do more of that. But the problem is that so often we put such a burden of assessment on those early pieces that people are afraid to screw around, so they don't actually explore, so they don't actually develop that next tier of skills and insights, so they really can't move to the next level after that.
I think that's probably the nugget of the most challenge, the brilliance of stating it that way, is that kids are afraid to try. And if you're afraid to try, all things are off the table, and it's scary to see kids timid, to not want to add an extra chocolate chip to that cookie dough, like, seriously, but another thing that I think is important to recognize, and maybe this is critical race theory components as well, but I was working on a high school design in Cleveland where the population was 90% minority. And so a lot of those things, like Lucy, you were talking about not wanting to miss a class because you're afraid you're gonna, whatever. The currency, the currency that these students had was not about who's going to what college and who's going to make A's and who's going to be valedictorian. It's who has the most friends, who has the most followers on Instagram. It's a social capital. And so what the teachers there were trying to do is engage the students so that the measure of their success was in the social response to an assignment or whatever, so that the students would have that motivation to achieve the learning, but the carrot, the motivation was how many people thought that was really cool. And maybe that'll get them to college, but that's not their capital. My capital with my kid is do your homework so you can get into college. Theirs is, do your work so your friends will think you're cool.
So I
go ahead.
So thinking about this in terms of it's finding the right fit for your philosophy as a teacher, as a parent. And if I were going to do it all over again and go seek out a school, that's also a lot of privilege too, to be able to choose that school, to choose that environment. There's a network of schools that are, and I can find the link, of progressive schools. Brightworks might be one of them. And if I were doing it all over again, maybe I would have gone that route and looked for them. I'm wondering, what are some other schools out there that you guys have seen? All of us have been in 5 million schools where you feel like that they really get it, and are similar to kind of this mindset that we're talking about in terms of looking at things a little bit more holistically. Anybody else have any other ideas?
Maybe the downtown school in Seattle, Lucy, the spin-off of, what's it? Oh my God.
Lakeside. It's a spin-off of Lakeside.
Yeah. That, I interviewed that head of school, who's just brilliant, but they even, even their content, like their mathematics is all about data now, they've shifted it that way, that it's not like algebra, calculus, you know what I mean? Their physics isn't about classical, it's about quantum, because we live in a quantum age, but yet physics is still taught so basically, I feel, like even if you go with the AP, that's all about classical physics, kids never get to see anything with quantum, which is what I was teaching, when I thought physics, because one, it's way more interesting as well, because like classical is fine, but it's almost like history, and so that is one school I would recommend. An anecdote from a startup school in New York, the Portfolio School. One of their heads of schools told me that they frequently have parents saying, "Oh, we really love what you're doing, but there's no way we're taking the chance," which is an interesting one, right? Which I think is like mind blowing. We think it's awesome you're doing all this stuff, but because the bottom line is, we all know high school's priority, it's designed to get students into university. The learning is second, whatever that is. And I don't know how you change that, but that's the focus, as we know, in any school I've ever worked at least. And it's not till you break that down, I think, what we'll see some change.
You know, one of the things that's interesting to me is how, and I think about this from an ecological perspective. Like, if you think about how much energy is being burnt off at each school in the US and in the world for projects that are landfill content, you know, like, I'm going to do this thing, it's going to get assessed, but then it's going to go into the dumpster. And, you know, where I recognize this was like, so for my, you know, English majors classes, their final papers, their, big projects were due at the final. They were due the last day of class or the last week of class, certainly, which meant there was no way for me to grade it before people, went off for the holidays and then came back. So I would always say, like, okay, I'll mark all your papers and you can come by my office and get them next term. And like 2 people out of 100, say 2 people a term would come back. And what that meant to me was, what that demonstrated was, they did not actually care about that paper at all. It was not part of an ongoing project for them. It was empty, bound for the trash from the beginning. And so what we're doing is we're just burning off all this stuff, and all that stuff requires assessment that's a bolt-on. And what I thought was interesting about Amy's example, for example, of the social media school, right, is at least that's something that there is this kind of natural assessment that's happening there. And, kids are learning about things like, oh, well, if I post this at, 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, maybe no one will look at it. So maybe I need to think about, like setting my postings of this for some key points. And so I'll look at my, demographics and figure out when most viewers are. And then I'll, like, that's really interesting. Or what you're talking about, where if you think about math as like, let's look at statistics, let's look at figuring out a real world situation. The number one predictor of whether or not a student will finish high school is whether they fail or pass Algebra 1.
Yeah, I know. No, but Bill, that's why with all of my students, graduate and high school, I tell them, design something that you need or that your school needs. I don't want to be like, I just don't want to be you like adding something in, I don't want to waste your time, so use it for that.
Yeah, the key is, though, you're harnessing that energy for a real good in the world. And there are a lot of real goods that need to be done in the world. There's a lot of real service that needs to be done. But right now, we're just burning off all that energy like it doesn't matter. I mean, it's like setting fire to, this incredible resource.
No, it is. I never get any of them going wrong. Everyone produces something, It's none of this not handing in. It's made because they design it, it's their thing. And I think giving them that power and trust, they're great. I just don't believe there's anything as a bad student, just a bad teacher. I think you have to design for students, And when I hear people complain about students, I'm thinking you need to design for them, It's because pretty much they're the students, But I tend to be on that very extreme side of being so pro-student and anti-teacher.
It's disappointing when you hear colleagues say, when colleagues, I remember colleagues saying, oh, I came to this school because I wanted to work with this caliber of students, and they're not living up to my expectations. And I that kind of mantra I heard, not maybe that explicitly, but that was the intent. It's your job to take your kids where you want them to go. And I think we've not looked at problems that are facing schools that are less resourced. We've always looked at it as a control issue, as opposed to why are these kids not engaged? And I don't know why it's so hard to get around that. And I think that there's been a big disservice, particularly I see it in Chicago, of charter schools thinking they can work kids harder, faster, more, and they're really not doing it differently. Academy for Global Citizenship is a completely different animal. They've really tried to be thoughtful about how they've developed their school. But the regular charter schools that want to replicate really quickly are all about, they're not about doing anything differently at all. It's just more of the same.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got kind of all these things spinning around in my head, because I think, I mean, one of the challenges with equity and inclusion and access, I think, is also solved by what we're talking about with this kind of getting people to do things or make things in their own contexts or communities. So it's really easy for me to imagine a project that's based on my own biases and my own perspective, and that's only going to then feed people who are like me. But if I do open this out and kind of let people explore and let people do things that are meaningful to them, then, part of what's happening too is their stuff, their community, their approach, their ideas, there's a place to value those too. And I think that's also got to play into kind of what we're thinking about assessment and about authentic assessment, as opposed to this kind of bolt-on model.
Yeah. Tying this back to last week's thing, when Kurt was talking about how they've taken some of the federal funding that they've gotten in their district, and he talked about they invested in human capital. They knew they couldn't hire more people, but they invested in the people that they have with training on what's developmentally appropriate with kids and that sort of thing. It seems to me like schools would immediately see improvement if they invested in training on inquiry, on assessment like this, and kind of some baseline things, and strengthening the skills of teachers in that. If they just took some of this money that's coming and worked on that sort of thing, I think they would see immediate improvement in attendance, and everything else. And so, it's really interesting to me, this whole conversation, and it's all tying together nicely.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, so much, funding professional development, all those become a really important piece of this, because I think teachers, one of the challenges for people, with the reason you stick to this kind of old assessment regime, is that, I don't have the training to do that, or I don't feel qualified to do that, or I don't have the resources to do that. And so, and everything seems to be sort of a piece. If I'm not going to transform the assessment, then I'm not going to try the project that's different. So I'm not going to integrate the technology that's there. So I'm not going to, and it kind of all spins together, I think.
Hey, Bill, I wanted to tell you, so when I read your article on the end of education, and I sent it to various people to see how they would react, I sent it to one assistant head of school, because the reason I sent it to this assistant head is that with COVID, they got rid of the exams, right? They'd thrown them out the window. And I said, oh, look at this. It's really interesting. Is the plan to not bring back exams anymore? And she said, oh, absolutely, Don. What about those students that are good at exams? I swear to God. I thought a conversation end, because that mindset, like that's a behavior you would have to work. And I just dropped it. I was like, I'm not even getting into a conversation, but it was shock. I was shocked, as usually I am with these things, but that was the
that's really interesting, Don. I have my sister's kid is really not so, he's smart. It's just really not so great in school, but he tests well. So, his ace in the hole to get in college was the SAT. And my kid's kind of the opposite. He does great in school, but he doesn't test so well. So his ace in the hole is his grades and, that side. So, I'm not sure what the answer is there, but it's, the key is that not one size fits all.
No, definitely not.
When we started doing some kind of crazy things, when we had, all of our iPhones in the class, the people who, there were two groups that really pushed against it. And one was parents who were like, kids are just going to be frittering their time away on those things, and they need to learn. And the other was the students with the best grades, because they were like, you're changing the rules. Like, we're really good at tests, and now you're going to make us do stuff, and it's going to put us at a disadvantage. And it was fascinating to watch, like, that shifting of the rules meant that different people were going to get access. I think that's interesting, and it fits with what you were saying. But there are some people who are great test takers. I can't think of a situation where people have to do that in the real world, but
yeah, I don't know. But Amy, your point of that, like it's definitely not one way. And I don't think it exists in the US, but when I did my master's in Ireland, I could have did a master's by course or by research. I chose to do it by research and put in a thesis. Just because to me it was more meaningful, and maybe that is the way we should be thinking about it now, is that you just have
about choice,
right?
Yeah.
So do you want to take the test route to high school graduation, or do you want to take the PBL route?
I like that. That would be nice. And the thing is that I don't see a lot of choice. I'm not opposed to charter schools. I like that they provide a choice to families and that sort of thing. I think the idea, I think but they have to be done. It has to be done well. So like in Wisconsin, the charter schools are done in partnership with the public schools. So they may share, bus services or a gym or something like that, but they kind of piggyback on each other. And then I believe in Wisconsin too, like if you're not happy with your home district, a parent can drive their kid to a neighboring district if they have room for that child. So there's some flexibility, and it's not looked at as a us versus them. Whereas in Illinois, where I live, we have no choice other than the public schools or to go to a private school. There's nothing like in between. All the charters, except for like one that I can think of, are in the city. And that's not the kind of choice I'm talking about either necessarily. I'm thinking about Napa, like the Napa public schools have, they have what's the network of schools? They have their own public schools, but then there's a project-based learning school in Napa that is part of the school district, but it's just a choice within the district. And it seems like other parts of the country are like I've seen, it seems like in some places in Texas that there's some schools that go all PBL. There's places that are willing to investigate and do things a little bit differently, but there's no uniformity to it. And it depends, for parents, it's the luck of the draw where you live or what you're willing to do in terms of seeking out those kinds of places. It's not, it's so interesting to me that we're so all over the place, which is, I don't know.
Yeah.
So a book is what you're thinking, Bill, with this?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, I had the cube for a long time, and I would talk to people about ways to think about that in terms of constructing a learning environment. But you could construct a learning environment, but then what do you do in it? So FTMS is then what you do in it, but then, okay, well, I did that, but that doesn't, like, how do I assess that? How do I test that? Like, you've got to have kind of all the stuff going at once there. So I don't know, but I see this as part of a system. I want to get people engaged in the 3 dimensions because like our world needs it. If people can't figure out what a mask does during a pandemic, there's some real problems that we've got in the world, and we're going to have to figure out a way to address those. And so I want to get people out there. I want to get people out there in a way that's productive for them. The other thing that the FTMS does, I didn't really talk about it a whole lot today, but it's designed not only to be a sort of framework and guide for students, but it's also a framework and guide for teachers. So it's about the teachers learning their own obsolescence. So, the direct instruction lets me be the teacher. Yeah. And then as people are tinkering, you know, I can ask questions. I can be the sort of, you know, I'm still there, I'm still involved, but I'm letting go. And then, you know, as they go out and make, like, I'm a resource person, but they've got a lot of other resource people. I'm just kind of part of the community. And then when it comes, you know, when it comes back to the sharing, I'm just part of this kind of general community, even with the students. So it's designed to sort of move people in that way. And we've been using it, Dee and I have both been using it. She's been using it in schools, and I've been using it with professional development and stuff. And it's actually, it's kind of crazy how flexible it is and what you can do with it. So we're doing stuff like, I don't know, she's taught Final Cut using it, and I've done storytelling workshops, and, you know, I mean, it's just, but it
seems like
needs some kind of measurement.
It's a couple of things. It seems like the maker community would be great to connect with on this. And there's a maker symposium going on this weekend, I believe, that Make is putting on. And so that might be one place. But I'm also thinking of like Gary Steger and Sylvia Martinez, who wrote the what's the name of their book, Invent to Learn.
Yeah.
They actually have a publishing arm too, Bill, that might be interesting for you. You know, Gary, you know, I would, you know, Gary has, I'm sure, has a lot of thoughts on this himself. But seriously, I
really
think, like,
you think so?
Yeah, I imagine that. But I think this, like, this kind of, I guess I think people who are not super experienced with making sometimes lack, or schools that are starting out with, like, they build a makerspace and then, like, what do we do with it? Like, using your framework would be really helpful for people to structure, I think, that kind of work. I see that to me, that's a first application would be to look at something like that, and as a learning designer.
Yeah.
And I would love to see you do some workshops on this, on training teachers how to use it. I think that would be incredibly practical. I would take that.
Yeah, we've actually been doing some, in Denmark. We're using that framework kind of. So we start people out working with it, and then here's how to use it, and here's how you can use it in your own classes. So we've been doing that, and I think we did a series for IARCOS, which is the East Asian Regional Council of Schools. And so, you know, but yeah, it's something that grew out of some cubic stuff. It's something we were working on. We developed a bunch of materials when I was working at PyTop. This was how we built kind of all those coding and robotics materials, was using FTMS, but we called it something different at the time. But it was basically that structure, and it does seem like something that, you know, I'm feeling pretty good about it. It's passed a lot of tests. I've also been I've got a project with the government of Wales. I'm part of this project with the Welsh Educational Authority, and I think they're going to build one maker space that's using FTMS, just to kind of see if it works and see. So I don't know, but.
Okay, so I think everybody wants to get on with their Friday and go have a beer, and now we should have happy hour after this. But Bill, thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for this opportunity, and thanks for all the thoughts and, you know, consideration. I really appreciate everybody helping out.
And keep us posted on your progress with this and how it evolves, because I think it would be great. Next week is going to be, we're going to talk about funding. We're going to kind of brainstorm around the funding and kind of debrief around the first session of that. And then in 2 weeks, we're going to, Kelly Gray is going to be joining us and talking about her STEAM program. And she actually might be a good partner for this in her STEAM and her design lab at Barnard and the work that they're doing with the New York schools. I mean, like, this would go hand in hand. And she was here she was here at our meeting this morning, but maybe she'll watch the webinar later on. But that might be, it's kind of interesting how things are kind of connecting.
Yeah.
Not intentionally. Anyway.
Yeah, well, I've written some articles about FTMS that are out. I mean, that they're on Medium already that I did kind of end of last year and stuff. So I'm walking through it. But anyway.
But Bill, you know, I'm thinking as well. I'm this school, Marymount, where I'm teaching the entrepreneurship classes. They're a finalist for an Edward E. Ford Foundation grant. They only give grants to private high schools, right? And I think the total is like $500,000, so it's not like a lot. But I was trying to build into the proposal an assessment piece, and if we get it, I can hopefully bring you in there to do that.
Oh, I'd love that. Yeah,
right.
I'd love that.
And because what it is they've built a new campus which will open in 2023, and it's in East Harlem. And actually, I was up there yesterday. It's now on 6 stories. There's going to be 10. But I started this thing pre-COVID called the Harlem STEAM Consortium. So what we were doing is we were bringing in East Harlem educators and helping them build out STEAM spaces, you know. Yeah, and this is an extension of that. And so it would be also good to build in evaluation with it. So that's sort of the bones of the project. And that's why we applied for this grant to extend it. So
cool.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's